Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And we're going to talk about a lot of politics and a lot of energy and power today with my friend, Anas Alhajji. Anas, welcome back to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Good morning.
Good morning to you. So, Anas, you know you've been on the podcast before. Guests introduce themselves. So you have a long CV. You're a PhD. You've been in this business a long time. But please give us 1 minute on who Anas Alhajji is.
Well, probably I don't need a 1 minute. Just my Twitter account basically told the whole story. All things energy.
Okay, great. Let's dive in then. We spoke in March. That was the last time. This is your third appearance on the Power Hungry Podcast. Welcome back.
Thank you.
But in March, we talked about what had happened in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. You said at that time, as I recall, Russian oil is going to find a way to market. That has certainly been the case. What's happened since then? And then I think broaden that out too. And if you don't mind, answer the second question at the same time. Has the global energy crisis gotten worse since March? Has it gotten any better? And if so, where, how, and where's the trend here?
Well, generally speaking, and we have to be really precise about what happened in terms of Russian invasion of Ukraine, is that it's the sanctions on Russia that are causing the problems. Of course, this is not an excuse for anything, but just because we need to understand that it's not the Russians who are cutting the supplies. It's the sanctions that are causing the problems in this case. And it was very clear from the history of sanctions for the last 100 years or so, and from the experiences of the Iranians and the Venezuelans, that the Russian oil is going to flow no matter what. And what we've seen since March until now is that Iran basically did tear up couple of pages from its sanctions book and give it to Russia. And Russia basically took those few pages and made a big book out of them. So they multiplied everything the Iranians did by 100.
So I'm sorry to interrupt, but explain what you mean by that. That the Iranians found ways around sanctions and the Russians did the same. For instance, explain how that.
Correct.
What do you mean there?
Iran has long experience with circumventing the sanctions. And they have customers, they have thousands of shell companies around the world. They deal with governments, they deal with mafia, they deal with even the Russian mafia. And when Russia got stuck because of the sanctions, the Iranians were there to help. So all the ships that's being used by Iranians to ship their oil basically are shipping the Russian crude right now. And all the technology, all the routes, all the dealers, all the middlemen, the shell companies, all of them just kind of got transferred almost, or being cloned, if that's the right expression.
I see. Turning off the ship transponders so that the tankers
that's one of them, but there are more to that. Of course, China is on it too. China been helping Iran since 2019, and they provided technology and various tricks so they can smuggle that oil, and they are doing the same thing with Russia. Now, India jumped on the wagon, but the Indians basically are kind of very clear about their motives and the way they are dealing with it. So they are not, in a sense, they are not concerned about the future for a simple reason, because the Indians know that one of those days, when Bush comes to shove, they will stop importing Russian crude. That's not the case for China. So the Indians basically are trying to grab as much as they can before they get the hammer from the United States.
And the Indians are able to buy the Russian crude at a discount, right?
Everyone is buying it at a discount. Most of OPEC members and OPEC Plus members are buying it at discount. That's why if you look at the Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they are buying Russian crude.
And everyone is buying it. Because on the face of this, and I've seen this, but I've read reports rather about that Saudi, I didn't know about the Emiratis, but that they were buying Russian crude. So they're buying Russian crude and then using it internally and then selling their own crude onto the market. How is that working?
Well, the story about, I need to clarify this point, because the story about Saudi Arabia importing Russian crude is really a non-story. But I think it became a big story by Reuters and Bloomberg because Biden was visiting Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
Otherwise, the amount is very small. It's about 58,000 barrels a day, and probably only during the summer. It might develop to something bigger later on. But what they've been reporting was very small. Even the UAE was importing way, way larger than that, a larger amount.
And why, though? Why would they be importing Russian crude?
There are a few things here. First of all, it wasn't crude, really. It was fuel oil for their power plants. And that's what you've been writing about for a very long time, about the power generation, power plants, etc. So they use fuel oil. It wasn't crude. But it is very clear how the game is being played right now, that Russia is shipping its oil to India and China and some other OPEC members, and they are working on several fronts in several ways to do oil swaps, even with Iran, with Algeria, etc., with the Gulf states. And with India and China, all they get to do basically is import the Russian crude and then refine it and then sell it to the rest of the world at global prices or world prices in terms of gasoline and diesel and everything else.
I see.
There was a problem between India and Russia, and it is an evolving problem, and it might get to the limit where, or to the breaking point. And the reason why, because the Indians, when they were buying the Russian crude, they thought they can squeeze more out of Russia. So when the discount was about like $28, they wanted more, and they always wanted more. And the Russians basically got really angry at that. And one of the problems that took place was the Russians wanted to kind of teach the Indians a lesson. So we ended up with several issues. The first one is we have a cyber attack on all India that stopped Indian production within India itself, which kind of very suspicious, because it was at the time when the Russians were angry at India because they were bargaining with them. And then later on, India imposed excise profit tax on all companies in India. And the idea was everything they are importing, they cannot export because they want to keep that all within India. And the Indian companies basically were really angry at that because they lose a lot of money. The government retracted that within a week. But the reason for the retraction, because the Russian government asked the Indian companies to pay for their oil in UAE dirham.
I see. Instead of paying in dollars or in rubles,
or in rupee, basically, because that's where the Indian rupee basically was used. And that was a significant development because it means several things. And one of them basically is that the Russian government does not trust the Indian government. And the reason why, because if they keep selling to India and the Indians keep depositing the revenues in Indian banks, and then they yield to US pressure, they can confiscate the Russian revenues within India. But if they take it to the UAE, and the Indians have massive presence in the UAE, even at the highest levels, especially in business, so they can deposit that money in UAE dirham, in UAE banks, and Russia can guarantee that it will be paid.
I see. Well, let me interrupt you there, because that is, since we started talking a bit about currency, because that was one of the things that just was remarkable to me, is that despite all these sanctions and despite the talk about trying to isolate Russia, the ruble saw a story just a few days ago that it's one of the strongest currencies in the world today in terms of performance so far this year. The same with the U.S. dollar. So to me, am I wrong to think that that's and that meanwhile the euro is falling? But is that how directly correlated is that strength of those two currencies, the ruble and the dollar, connected to the fact that Russia and the U.S. are big oil producers. Is it easy? Is it
Not
easy
really.
enough to put it in those terms?
The ruble basically is artificially high. And the reason why, because the way the Putin played it, let me rephrase this because this is a kind of a very important point to mention. Putin has a very strong legal team. And I say very like world-class legal team that understand the international law, understand US law, and understand European laws. And if you look at everything they've done until now, they really did not violate any law. And I'm talking about commercial laws.
Okay.
They did not.
Okay.
But what they did is they played it in a way where they say, okay, you have to pay me in ruble. Whoops. Well, the contract calls for paying in dollar or euro. Then we are going to play around it, and you can pay in dollar or euro to this bank, and this bank will convert it to ruble, and then we can receive it. So everyone was trying to play the game legally in this case. And it was very clear that in case of India, that Putin advisors or legal advisors basically played the game correctly in terms of being legal. So they did not violate any agreements or any contracts at all in this case. And the choice of the UAE is simply because the UAE is famous worldwide for being kind of freer than other countries when it comes to finance and banking.
Right.
At the same time, Russian oligarchs.
And if I can jump in there, so is that would that be Dubai or would it be Abu Dhabi or both, or it just is the Emirates in general?
It is Emirates in general. Of course, Dubai has a very long history and it has a very long Russian presence. And most of the Russian, the richest of Russia, the oligarch and others, all own properties in the UAE. So they have accounts, they have bank accounts, they have shell companies, they have others, etc. There was a time, by the way, when Russian women used to come to the UAE in droves. And what they do is they get paid by businessmen in Russia. They come in and they have a shopping list. So they're being given a shopping list and they do the shopping in Dubai and they return within 3-4 days with whatever they bring with them. Legally in Russia, you cannot bring merchandise more than a certain limit. So every woman will carry to the limit. But they come in thousands. So the amount of goods that goes from Dubai to Russia historically was huge through those women. So what I'm saying here is the connections and the ties and the banking systems and the money, they have a very long history there.
And so this is all, I mean, as I'm hearing you talk about this, that this is just yet another example or another chapter of what is a decades-long story about oil being this fungible commodity that it's going to find a place, it's going to find a market. And you made this point when we talked a few months ago, that trying to constrain it, trying to put caps on the price, which is one of the other things that's been discussed, that this is largely futile, that these kinds of efforts are because the world depends on so heavily on oil that trying to shut off the flow from Iran or Venezuela, where it simply it's not very effective. Is that fair?
Well, look at the other side. Sanctions never worked. And when we talk about sanctions, not only about oil, about all kinds of things. And I believe I am the only oil analyst in the world who've done field work on this in several countries. And what I saw on the ground basically was beyond amazing. I mean, it's the same story of drug cartels and how they smuggle drugs and all this stuff. It's exactly the same story. There is a lot of money to be made. And the harder the government makes it, the more money they make. And the harsher the laws and the probability of being caught, the more money they make. And and I've seen it in some countries where literally young men drop school and universities completely because they can make so much money out of being smugglers than to get education.
Well, it's remarkable. Well, let's come back to the U.S. for a minute here, because we just over the past week we've seen this Manchin-Schumer bill. What was dead a few weeks ago is now suddenly back. They're 369 billion in energy-related spending. I've been very critical of this, which I won't repeat now. What's your view of that? What the Manchin-Schumer bill? What does it say? I guess more broadly, because you're writing in Arab for Arabic audiences, and you're writing for English speaking audiences. How do you see this in terms of how this is perceived globally? What is your or in other countries? How do you perceive this Manchin-Schumer
Yes.
bill and what it's doing?
Of course, I mean, we can speak for 12 hours on this, but we have a limited time.
Yes.
But the best way to describe it is this way, that every senator basically put something into that bill, but there was no consolidator to consolidate that bill together. So the contradictions within the bill basically are laughable, because there was no consolidation among the various interests in these. And there is a broad language basically that will make many of those policies obsolete. So you don't want to import things from China because they are critical materials, etc. But the language is so broad that no one knows where the threshold is, and therefore it can be stretched. But the best part of it, and that's why kind of I laugh when someone asks me about it, is the only reason why the senator from West Virginia agreed to all of this, because he realized what others did not realize from the Democratic Party. He realized that spreading electric vehicles will increase the demand for coal.
Uh-huh.
End of story. I mean, it seemed like the others did not realize this, but the fact is, if that's going to lead to a spread of coal and increasing consumption of coal, or at least not reducing it,
right,
that means emissions are going to be way higher than predicted.
Because you're going to add more electric demand. But I thought that, well, that's interesting what you said about the contradictions in the bill are laughable, because I've been looking at this now for a week, and I've written a piece that's going to be published soon on it, but that ExxonMobil and the Natural Resources Defense Council endorsed it. I thought, how many pieces of legislation in American history are getting the stamp from the head of Exxon and the head of NRDC? I think it speaks to the contradictions that you just talked about.
This reminds me of a story, and I think this is a short story, but it reflects some of the bill. At the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, announced that he is going to punish Russia and support Ukraine by halting crude imports from Russia, which is a big thing. The only problem is Canada does not import any crude from Russia. And there are many things in the bill just like that.
The virtue signaling.
Okay, which means that Exxon understood this when they supported the bill, because it's exactly this Justin Trudeau syndrome when he banned the imports of crude from Russia, and Canada does not import any crude from Russia.
Right. So on Twitter, well, let me first ask about, since you mentioned we were talking about Exxon, they just reported huge, I don't have the numbers in front of me, huge profits for the last quarter, Chevron as well. Suddenly, there's been this reversal. Just a few months ago, we're going to, these big oil companies are obsolete. Exxon lost this proxy fight with what is engine number 9, or what do they put people on their board? But here these big, the big integrated oil companies are suddenly just killing it. Their stock prices are way up. What do you make of that? I mean, was this inevitable? I recall when we talked, now this is some months back, you said there's an energy crisis brewing, and now we're in the middle of it. Was this just inevitable that these companies would come out with these kinds of earnings?
Yes, and this was predictable. But the funny part of this is all of them now, especially the green ones, are announcing expansion in their oil and gas facilities and investments.
Shell, BP.
Shell and BP, correct.
Right.
Correct. But this is not a surprise. But when we talk about their profits, we have to be careful. And the reason why, because the return on capital is still low. I mean, these are huge companies, and their capital, excuse me, their capital expenditures are huge. So their return on capital remain low. And if you look at the 10-year return on capital, it's extremely low. So those profits basically are not a big deal when you look at it in terms of return on capital. The other issue is
that's an interesting point, particularly when you compare it to the return on capital in the tech industry, right? Which is far higher. The profit margins are far higher, and yet the oil and gas industry is pilloried because of the size of the profits, but they're never compared to Apple or Microsoft or Google or the other big tech
not only
outfits.
that. If you look at the taxes paid by the major tech companies versus the oil business, you can see a big story there too, because as you know, forget about the oil majors. We have thousands of companies that are small and medium sized in the United States. And we have kind of family business running oil business.
Right.
And they all pay taxes.
And that's well, and royalties to the states
Correct.
and to individual mineral owners and the rest of it. Well, let me point out something. Again, my guest is Anas Alhajji. He is the editorial advisor at Attaqa, which is the only Arabic language media outlet focused on energy. This is his third appearance on the podcast. You can find more about Anas at anasalhajji.com. Follow him on Twitter at Anas Alhajji. And then Attaqa is on the web at attaqa.net, ATTAQA.net. On Twitter, just in the last day or two, you said that current market fundamentals support Brent prices between $100 and $110. A recession will lower oil prices. The decline depends on the severity of the recession. And then here's the part that I want to ask about. I am ultra bullish on oil, Q4 2023 and thereafter. I am more bullish on natural gas. Why so bullish?
There are several reasons for this. As you know, we don't have enough investment to keep up with demand anyway. In fact, we don't have even investment in renewable energy to keep up with demand. But this is not the big story of the future. The big story of the future is that some of the green policies are going to fail, and some of them already failed. And
as what we're seeing in Europe.
Correct. And the failure of those green policies by default means higher demand for oil, gas, and coal. By default.
So you're saying because they're not going to be able to produce enough power energy or power that it's going to be resort back to more hydrocarbon demand.
Correct. But here is the problem. The problem is not a single outlook is counting that demand. It's not being counted.
From the big forecasters.
Correct. So it's not being counted. So we have the shortages because of lower investment, and then we have the increase in demand because of failure of green policies, and that's not being counted. So it's going to hit us really hard. And what we are going to do is going to be an energy crisis. It's going to be a global energy crisis. And the same thing we've seen with Sri Lanka. We are going to see many countries failing exactly like Sri Lanka. And that's why this is a message for those who are saying, look, we are in America. We don't care about the rest of the world. We need to keep our SPR, and we need to do this, and we need to do this. Look, if you have failures like this, like Sri Lanka around the world, you cannot stay idle and just look around. If you want to dominate the world, you want to be a leader of the world, you have to be involved. And therefore, we have to care. So the issue, and that's why the discussions I have with colleagues on Twitter regarding the SPR. People have to realize that the impact of the SPR releases by the Biden administration was huge, was massive.
And to interrupt, you're talking about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in Louisiana, where the Biden administration ordered releases, and we're at, what, 1 million, 2 million barrels a day, something like that?
1 million for 6 months, which is 180 million, which is a huge by any standard. But people are mistakenly looking at it in a different way when they look at the impact. Because they say, look, oil prices before Russian invasion was $80. They are above 100 today. Therefore, there is no impact. That's absolutely the wrong way of looking at it. If it wasn't for the Strategic Petroleum Reserve release, oil prices would have been above 140 today.
So are you in favor? So you're saying that the SPR releases were good policy? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I need to define that because this is very important. About 20 years ago, I wrote a paper that was during the George W. Bush administration, discussing those issues. And by assessing the impact of the SPR releases, the conclusion was very clear that the idea of using 30 million and 60 million does not make sense. The amount is too small. So there were two recommendations in that paper. And the first recommendation is the release has to be huge. And the language of the release is extremely important. The language of the release has to say something like, we will continue this until we achieve this goal. And no one paid attention to it until the Biden administration came in, and they did exactly both. A huge release with the wording, even when they chose 1 million barrel a day instead of 180 million every 6 months or for 6 months. That was intended. This was a very important statement to say. To say 1 million barrel a day.
And that 1 million in a marginal supply business can have a big impact.
Big time. And people miss this point because those who are ultra bullish, they kept arguing, well, this is limited only for 6 months. Well, show me a shale well can produce 1 million barrel a day for 6 months.
Yeah.
Okay. Shale, but we know we are talking about 700 barrels a day and for a few months, and that's it. So to discount 1 million for 6 months is just complete nonsense.
Well, so
this is a huge amount.
So what about because I've seen this argument too, that, oh, well, we're releasing oil from the SPR that we bought at 30 or 40, and now we're putting it onto the market, and then we're going to have to buy it back at 80 or 100. Is that a valid criticism, or is that just part of just politics?
Well, theoretically, yes, but practically not. First of all, the United States stayed without strategic petroleum reserves for 110 years.
Say that part again. I didn't follow you there. Say
the United States stayed without strategic petroleum reserves for 110 years.
Did not have. So you're tracking this back to what, 1860 or something?
To the beginning, correct, 1860. Yep. Okay, and we had wars, we have crises, we have all kind of things, and we lived through it without any problems. And the oil industry basically managed it. In 1977, at the end of 1977, we started filling the SPR. And many people did not like it. Many people wanted to abolish the SPR. In fact, some Republicans wanted to abolish the whole Department of Energy altogether, as you recall. So the idea here is that this, the SPR, when George W. Bush decided to increase its size to 700 million after September 11th, there was no justification for it. I mean, there was the fear factor, but that's it. But then by 2010, we started the shale oil revolution, and we added between 2010 and 2020, we added 8 million barrels a day within the U.S.
Of new production.
Right. In the U.S. So what is that? How you are going to count that? You cannot compare the SPR now to the SPR during the Bush years, because our production went from 6 million to 13 million.
I see. Well, that's an interesting point.
Okay.
And then we still, even with this 180 million release, then there's still, what, 600 million barrels still there? What the total capacity is? What,
about 390. I mean, after that, we'll end up with 3, which is enough for a year, by the way. So a million barrels. Okay. But right. There is another point that's very important.
Okay.
When we built the SPR, we built it to cover imports, because the disruption because of the oil embargo of 1973 was imports. And the problem is shale is light sweet crude, as you know.
Right.
And therefore, we are importing the heavier sour crudes. That's where the shortage is. That's where the threat is. That's why most of the release is sour right now, simply because that's what refiners want. And when we rebuild, we need a smaller amount. We don't need to go back to the 630 that we had. We need a smaller amount, and we need a quality that covers imports, not what we produce inside the nation.
That's a really interesting point. I'm glad you made that, because that's you and I have talked about that, but it's the mismatch, one of the key issues, this idea of energy independence, and now
but here there is one problem. There is one problem.
Go ahead.
and we are going to have a space on this within the next couple of days, so we will explain it in details. As you heard the Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, basically talking about we need to encourage domestic production. And some people in the administration propose that we need to be involved in the financial markets. So we want to guarantee a price in the future when we purchase oil for the SPR, it will be a price good enough for producers. That does not make sense, because if you are talking about shale producers, you don't need that oil, period. You don't need it. So whom you are trying to help?
For the SPR you're talking about.
Okay. The SPR, basically, you are talking about Canadians, you are talking about Saudis, you are talking about Latin America. It's not U.S. producers. Yes, some producers in the Gulf of Mexico, but that's it.
Well, let me just finish that point, because I think it's important just for people who aren't familiar that what the U.S. is producing, as now said, light sweet. Well, that's a mismatch with American refining capacity. The overwhelming majority, particularly on the Texas Gulf Coast and the Gulf Coast, is designed to handle heavy sour crude. Why? Because they make a better. That was what they became accustomed to over decades, right? And they also make more money refining that. So we export light sweet and import heavy sour. Is that a fair summation?
It is a fair statement. We import about 6.5 million barrels a day. Right now, and almost all of it. And I say almost, the reason why, because we still have some regional issues, like when you talk about the Northeast or in some areas in the United States where you still import some light sweet simply because of Jones Act. We cannot get it there.
Right.
But most of it basically is medium to heavy sour. Right. And that's what we import. And therefore, the argument for refilling the SPR does not make sense as presented today by the Biden administration.
Gotcha. And we're talking today, this August 2nd, 2022. I want to return to this. We've talked now a lot about oil, and you said you're ultra bullish in your on your Twitter feed on oil after the end of 2023, and thereafter. I'm more bullish on gas. Why are you more bullish on nat gas than you are on oil?
The reason why, because when we have with the failure of the green policies, they will fall back on natural gas because of the climate change issues. So they are going to try to reduce. They will continue reducing their dependence on coal no matter what, despite the need for it.
Right.
But they will fall back on natural gas, and that's why I am more bullish on gas than oil.
And how much of that is then motivated too by the spread between the price of gas in Europe and the price of gas in the U.S.? We're at what I haven't looked today, but $8 or something on Henry Hub, and the TTF trading hub in the Dutch trading hub is, again, I didn't check today, but $59, $60. So what a seven-fold difference. Is that TTF, is the European demand and LNG exports, are those ultimately acting as a way to pull up domestic gas prices? Is it that clear of a correlation or a causation?
Yeah, just to be clear on this, that LNG price is the spot price, not the contract price.
No, fair enough. Yeah, but I'm just talking about what is the marker at TTF is 59, right? I don't know what the price for JKM or whatever.
The issue here is it's a function of the capacity of LNG trains around the world. So now we don't have enough capacity to meet global demand based on the current circumstances with Russia. So that's why this spread. And as you know, we lost the Freeport, that's 2 BCF a day, and we lost another plant in Australia. So we have some losses already. And that's contributing to prices. The issue that's being created by the Biden administration by emphasizing directing exports of energy to Europe is that it is increasing the competition between Asia and Europe, and increasing competition put more pressure on prices. And here I would like to emphasize one point, and it's a political point. The political point is here is this. What Putin wants right now, Putin wants to starve Europe. He wants to lower natural gas storage to the minimum. So, because this is a big card he's holding, and he can force Europe at least not to impose additional sanctions or not to enforce the existing sanctions. So
So the
by
less gas
lowering.
the less gas that Europe has in storage, the more vulnerable they are, and the more
Correct.
leverage Putin has.
So here is what he is counting on. He is counting on the following: that this heat wave and the drought that we see in Europe is going to consume all the gas in storage. By the time the hurricane season will start in the United States, and therefore the United States cannot come to the rescue, and therefore storage levels will decline substantially in Europe, and he can break the policy of the EU, where some countries will say, what the heck, I'm going to deal with Putin, whether above the table or below the table. It doesn't matter. But he wants to break the EU.
And he has all the cards now. I mean, it just
Correct.
seems like his leverage is increasing by the week.
But the Biden administration understand this point, and therefore they are directing all energy sources, even from Iran and Venezuela, to Europe, and asking the Gulf countries and others to increase supplies to Europe to prevent that from happening. And even President Biden, when he was asked, when he was at the NATO meeting, when he was asked by a journalist, it was very clear from his statement that, yeah, in a sense, let American consumers pay very high price as long as we protect Europe. So it was very clear.
Right, but as you're saying that, what pops in my head, and it's one of the things I wanted to ask you about, because we talked about this before, about and you predicted it, and you did it, and credit to you. You said that oil demand is going to rise because it's going to become one of the main fuels, not for electricity generation as well. And there's a new report that just came out from Raymond James that I thought was really interesting. It talks about fuel switching and the fact that here's what the line says: given the extraordinary cost of natural gas in Europe and Asia, north of $300 per barrel and $250 per barrel equivalent, respectively, some amount of fuel switching is guaranteed. And they're making the point that on a per MMBTU basis, that oil is in fact cheaper than natural gas. And so that we're going to see more electricity generated from oil because of that price spread, which is a point that you made. But the punchline that they're saying is that they think that this will increase oil demand by as much as 1 million barrels per day globally, in our view, in the winter quarters, is what they're saying. So that squares almost exactly with what you predicted now months ago, but that in fact oil is now cheaper. I mean, this is rather anomalous too, that oil's cheaper than natural gas on an energy equivalent basis, and even in some cases is competitive with coal. It's pretty remarkable, isn't it?
Right. But everyone is missing one point, and that's what the beauty of field research. Because field research give you insight that others cannot get when they are in their offices. The switching is limited because if the country does not have power plants that run on oil, they cannot do anything.
Right.
Okay. And some countries have those old plants, such as Sweden. They can go back to them and run them for a few weeks. They cannot run them more than that because they are very old and they are extremely inefficient, by the way. And the pollution is just unbelievable. That's why they shut them down in the first place. But the big issue is private generation. That's what they are missing. That's what we talked about last time.
Yeah.
There is a big issue. So I think it might go up even to 100 to 1.9, 2 million with the private generation. Because what happened with the private generation is you have factories in China that will be literally non-operational because the government is going to tell them you have electricity only for 3 days. You have to shut down for 4. But I already have orders for the next 3 years. I'm not going to stop. So I have those generators. These are big generators outside my factory. I'm going to basically run them on diesel or LPG or some other fuel, and I'm going to operate my machines.
That's an interesting point, and it's one that I think is really important. And I've seen it myself, right? The field research in Beirut, right? Where you have the generator mafia. People aren't going to do without electricity. They'll do what they have to do to get the electricity they need. This is the iron law of electricity. And so that and the generator sales, standby generator sales across the U.S. are skyrocketing. I mean, look at Generac's stock or look at Generac's revenue. I mean, it's just going through the roof. I mean, it's just remarkable because people are deciding this is where we're not going to do without electricity. So
there is one problem with that, Robert. I just want to
ahead.
mention it so people can realize this. The problem with the private generation is, unlike any other type of demand for oil and gas, is we will not know about it until after the fact.
And how so?
Because no one knows. I mean, no one is aware of private generation. No one is aware of that increase in demand for diesel until it happens.
So you're not going to it's hard to track. It's not an official EIA metric. Or,
correct.
I see.
So people will be wondering what's happening in the market. What's happening in the market, and they will not realize until 2 months later. It was only my field research that explained this to me when this was like 2004, 2005, when I discovered this. In fact, even in the Gulf, until today, there are areas in the Gulf states where there are, by the way, they still have Hardys too. They have Hardys and Windies and others, all of those on the beach, and all of them are running on private generators 24/7.
I see. So you only know, well, you can only try and pinpoint the increases in liquid fuel demand in retrospect, because you don't know where that or attribute it to that. Again, my guest is my longtime friend, and also we've known each other, 15 years or so, maybe more?
Way more than that. We started when I went to Ohio. When that was
when you were at Ohio Northern.
It's been 21 years now.
Yeah, that's a long time. My friend and guest, Anas Alhajji, he is the editorial advisor at Attaqa, which is the only Arabic language media outlet focused on energy. You can find him on Twitter at Anas Alhajji. He has a big following there, and also on anasalhajji.com. Let me ask you about that, because you're very active on Twitter, and you write in both Arabic and in English. How do you approach the different audiences? I mean, I'll tell you, when I write, who do I think about when I'm writing? Who's my audience? I think about writing for my mom, my late mother. Loved her dearly. I think, well, how do I explain it to her that she'll get it the first time, right? So that's who I think about when I write. But you're writing in two different languages. Do you have someone, how do you think about those two different audiences? And do you approach them differently?
I started writing in 1991 when I was a student. And I found writing to be one of the most important things in anyone's life. And I always tell my children, if you just focus on writing, even if you don't get a university degree, you will be fine. And the reason is this. As a university professor, when you are giving a lecture, you are looking at the kids in front of you, and you can see their face expressions. And if they don't understand you, you can see it without anyone asking questions. So you can change your exam, you can change what you are saying, you can explain it in a different way, you can give more examples, etc., until you see the relaxation on their faces in this case. The problem with writing is you don't see faces. You don't have that immediate feedback. Correct. So you don't know. And over time, when you keep writing, you realize, you can imagine their faces, and who is literally not happy with you, who is happy with you, who is going to cheer you, who is not going to understand this. You can imagine all of that when you start thinking about it. So the audience in Arabic are completely different from the audience in English. And the reason why, because in Arabic, they don't have the amount of knowledge and information they have about the oil industry. One of the reasons, for example, here, Americans, especially in the South, they grew up with the oil industry. They grew up owning the oil, operating the companies, doing all that stuff. In the Arab world, they never experienced that. It's government owned, it's completely isolated, fences all over, probably sometimes military protecting those things. They never seen it, they don't know it.
That's a real, I never thought of it that way, Anas. That's an interesting point. And when you say it, of course, I'm thinking, well, duh. I grew up in Oklahoma and saw, around the oil industry, people that my dad was friends with, they were in the oil industry. It was like, this wasn't a thing that was far away. But in Saudi Arabia or Iraq or Iran, these are controlled by the government, and the individual entrepreneurs aren't really involved in anything like the degree that they are here in the U.S.
Correct. So the audience are different, and therefore the style of writing is completely different.
Well, so is it fair to say you're saying that? Well, I don't mean this in a demeaning way, but that the Arabic speaking audience is not as sophisticated or as familiar then with energy issues more generally than the English speaking audience.
I don't want to say that. Let's say Americans better than English, because Europeans do not know much about it anyway.
Okay, fine.
But when you talk about Americans, at least they have more common knowledge of the oil industry than the Arabs. My view is that based on our experience with Attaqa and others, that the interest in energy issues in the Arab world is way, way more than Americans. To give you an example, we do a space every Tuesday at 2 p.m. Central Time in Arabic.
A Twitter space.
A Twitter space.
Yeah.
And the attendance is usually between 2,000 to 7,000 people. And we are talking about very special issues like the petrochemical industry and the future of the petrochemical industry, or the electricity sector in Iraq. So we are talking about very specific things, and yet we get 2,000 to 7,000 people on those spaces. So that shows you that there is a very strong interest. And when you look at the population and you look at the number of people attending spaces versus the population, it's very high relative to the United States.
That's interesting. So the level of the knowledge, and generally speaking, the knowledge is somewhat lower in the Arabic-speaking audiences, but the interest is higher.
Way higher, way higher. And we did a space recently on hydrogen, and it was 1 hour and a half, and 2,200 people attended.
Okay, well, I have to ask you about hydrogen. I've kind of, my opinion about hydrogen is kind of the same as electric vehicles. It's the next big thing, and it always will be. That's my bias. What's you give me your quick take on hydrogen?
I would rather talk about OPEC meeting tomorrow.
Hydrogen is the new darling on the block. I can point you to studies that were done 20 years ago that say the same thing as they're saying now.
Remember earlier when I talked about Justin Trudeau, when he banned Russian imports and Canada does not import? It's the same fiasco with hydrogen. It's the same thing.
A lot of talk.
It's not only a lot of talk. It's that, okay, what Europe wants a clean fuel. They want the hydrogen, but as long as it's made somewhere else and produced all kind of things, they don't care. Just give me the clean fuel in my country. But hydrogen it is going to be gray and blue for those who are familiar with the naming of the hydrogen. It's going to come from natural gas. It's going to come from petroleum. So there is emissions, but it's not going to be in Europe.
Right. Well, and that's assuming you have a supply chain that can move it around and so on, which is a whole other set of discussions. Correct. So on Twitter, I've just looked, you have over 100,000 Twitter followers. Do you have more Arabic speaking? Do you publish more in Arabic or in English on Twitter? And do you have more followers in Arabic than you do in English?
I'm sorry, because I just came back to Texas and I got all kind of allergies. So kind of my eyes are watering.
No problem.
And I think the composition is about 60-40, 60 non-English speakers and 40 English speakers. The amount of information I put is almost equal. Sometimes it's just the same tweet, but written in Arabic and English. And this was, by the way, an experiment because I did not know, and I have some friends who helped me with this, I did not know how a bilingual account is going to work and whether it's going to be successful or not. And this one worked. Others tried to mimic, and they failed. So I have not understood the formula yet, but I think the bottom line is when you put a lot of meat on the bone, people will forgive you for the other part.
How do you mean? I don't understand.
In a sense that you are adding a lot of information that does not exist anywhere else. So the guys who do not want to read in Arabic or use the translate button in Twitter to translate, they say, okay, I cannot really unfollow this guy. He just tweeted 10 tweets in Arabic, but I am waiting for the heavy stuff he's going to put in English. But if the amount of fresh ideas and information is going to decline, I think the account will not be successful.
Gotcha.
And that's why some people, and this is a true story, I have a guy who attacked me on Twitter big time. And I blocked him. And finally, I saw him at one of the conferences face to face. And he expressed the reason for his anger. He said, you put a lot of high quality paid information free.
And he
And
didn't
that's
like
what
you
was
giving. He didn't like you giving away good data.
correct. He said this should be paid, and so probably he felt some competition or something there. But the idea here is the success of a bilingual account probably is resting on the fresh ideas. Because I mean, let's face it. I'm not bragging here, but let's face it. I don't think there is an account in the energy sector today that is full of ideas. Forget about the data. Full of ideas like this account. I think there are more ideas in this account than, and people can write books on that. So I think people value that, and therefore they are, if they are English speakers, they can handle the Arabic tweets and just forgive me with the posting of them. And those in Arabic, basically, they can forgive me with the posting of the English tweets.
So what's the hardest part? Because I see you've just talked about this and the kind of the friction is there. What's the hardest part of that? Because, well, you know, we've known each other a long time. You for decades now, you've had kind of one foot in the Arab world and one foot in Dallas or in well, you're not in Dallas, you're in Flower Mound. Is that right? North of Dallas, right? What's the hardest part of that? About you're maintaining, I'm not trying to sound provocative, but almost two different identities, right?
It's not really like this. I think you can put it differently. It's not like the Arab world versus, I think, put it shale versus OPEC. Probably that's a better
shale versus OPEC. That's
yes, because you know most of my research was on OPEC, and then I worked in shale.
I see.
All those years and all this stuff. So so they are complementary in this case. I don't think there is any competition among them. But I will tell you a true story happened with me that answers your question directly on how people misunderstand my different experiences and background. I gave a presentation at one of the big universities in New Delhi in India. And the presentation was after the invasion of Iraq. And basically, I was explaining that the U.S. interest in Iraq is not to satisfy its thirst for oil, but oil is a strategic commodity, and it needs to be controlled so they can literally destroy the enemy's strength, which was Saddam Hussein, and then use the money from the oil to build a new government instead of depending on the taxpayer money. That's what the whole idea, of course, with all the data and all the Cheney report, you remember the Cheney policy and all that stuff at that time, that it is against U.S. policy to depend heavily on Iraqi oil because they needed diversification. And I thought I've done a great job, and there were probably over 100 faculty members plus students in the room. After I finished, a guy stood up who is a professor, and he started yelling and screaming, and he said, "You are a CIA agent."
Okay.
Okay. And I laughed. I told him, by the way, I just give this presentation in the United States. I was accused of being an agent to Saudi Arabia. So when people misunderstand those mixed backgrounds, they end up with these
distrust.
With this idea, it's not distrust as much as these. They are superficial ideas because they couldn't understand even the main theme of what I am talking about. But the idea is when you come with different backgrounds. In fact, even in India, I had a guy who stood up after him, and he said, "Oh, you talked about George W. Bush. I think you did that because India is free, and you couldn't say that in the United States."
Which I think whatever you said about George W. Bush would be fairly mild and would be punished. Well, that's interesting. So let's talk about Saudi Arabia, because you also have deep experience in Saudi Arabia. Why did Biden go? Why did Biden go to and meet with Mohammed bin Salman?
Whatever I'm going to say, this is my own personal assessment.
Sure.
Okay. I think you are talking about the deep state in the United States pushing Biden to revive those relationships, these historic relationships with Saudi Arabia.
That this was long U.S. policy, and that Biden essentially had to go. That this was not an option. That he could not just say, "Well, I'm going to ignore the Saudis," given the decades-long relationship.
Correct.
But to be clear, I don't like that term "deep state." I mean, I understand what it references, but I don't know. I mean, is just this? So is this the?
Well, let's call it the system. Let's call it. I mean,
Okay.
whatever.
Yeah. Okay.
At least
Fair
we
enough.
understand what it is.
Yeah.
It's not the person in a sense. And the issues in the Middle East been piling up for a long time. So you have the Yemen issue, you have the Iran issue, they have the Iraq issue, the Lebanese issue, and then you have the Abraham Accord and the dispute about those two islands that the Saudis retrieved from the Egyptians. Mm-hmm. And they needed someone to broker this deal. And the reason why, because the Saudis give those two islands to Egypt long ago because they want to avoid any contact with Israel. But the Egyptians signed the peace treaty in 1979. And in that peace treaty, it says that those islands have to be demilitarized because they are very close to Israel. They have to be demilitarized, and they will allow Israeli planes, whether civilian or military, to fly over them. Mm-hmm. And that was part of the treaty. Now the Egyptians are giving those to the Saudis. And there is no official recognition of both countries at all. And therefore the Israelis cannot fly anymore. And the Saudis might put arms on those.
Yeah, this is all news to me. I don't know anything about any of this.
So the job of Biden, or part of the job basically, is to settle this dispute and to assure the Israelis, okay, let's this transfer become complete. The Saudis are not going to put any arm there, and the Saudis will allow Israeli planes to fly.
So it's not just about oil or just about there are other issues around the Israeli government and the Abraham Accords, which apparently
and they solved that, by the way. So in terms of that, that was a success for Biden to solve that issue. So right now, NEOM, as you know, you heard of the word NEOM, which is the big, most advanced city in the world, is near those two islands. They can go ahead and develop those two islands. They will not be militarized, and at the same time, Israeli planes can fly over Saudi Arabia. They've been flying already because two countries next to Saudi Arabia normalized relations with Israel, that's Bahrain and the UAE. And both of them are part of the GCC. So Israeli planes were already, I'm talking about civilian planes, already been flying anyway. There are, of course, other reasons, because the issue of supporting the Saudis militarily. The Saudis now have a lot of money. They want to replenish the weapons, etc. So there is some financial interest there too. The question was whether Saudi Arabia will come back and reinvest in the United States. Businessmen met together, but seemed this did not lead to anything, simply because there are too many issues still hanging. I mean, you have JASTA, as you recall, that was a law passed by the Congress that allow September 11 families to sue Saudi Arabia.
Right.
And then you have the OPEC in Congress right now. They haven't voted on it, and we don't know where it's going to go. So the Saudi businessmen are really concerned that the atmosphere in the United States is not encouraging for them to come and invest.
Well, so as you're saying that, it was one of the other things I just wrote down here, and we're approaching an hour, so I want to end this pretty soon. But as you were saying this, and it was something else I wrote down even a little bit ago, was, has anything changed in that, in thinking about this long-term American involvement, the Carter Doctrine in the middle, in the Persian Gulf, the long history of Saudi Arabia? I don't pretend to be an expert. You helped me go to Saudi.
Yes, there is a change, and the change basically is.
Well, let me just ask. In terms of this long-term change, how different is it, and what has changed over, say, since the 70s in the oil embargoes? What has substantively changed in terms of the U.S. position and U.S. relationships, particularly with Saudi Arabia, but more broadly in the Middle East?
Well, Saudi Arabia has changed dramatically in the last 7 years.
Under MBS.
Under MBS. It changed in a way where, whether you're talking about politics, economics, social issues, religious issues, etc., the change are major. And therefore, some political analysts basically look at Biden visit this way. It is an acknowledgement of what MBS accomplished and literally acknowledging MBS as the next king, which is extremely important to the Saudis and extremely important to the Israelis. And therefore, we can understand Biden visit within the non-oil issues better than just to focus on the oil issues.
The political and strategic elements. And
I do have enough evidence, whether on personal level or from public statements, that Biden never mentioned oil in the visit to Saudi Arabia.
Interesting.
Okay, and that leads us to OPEC meeting tomorrow, because some people are saying that he did not talk about it because the advisors worked it out before the visit.
And that was already resolved, so no reason to bring it up.
So, and there are other reasons, because even if the Saudis are not going to increase production, why waste political capital on something you are not going to get anything out of it? But there is a conviction today in Washington that the Saudis are going to increase production tomorrow.
Or will announce that.
And the Biden administration is going to claim credit for that. My view, and for those who wants to check my Twitter account, because I wrote it on Twitter just a couple of hours ago, my view is, yes, OPEC Plus might increase production, but this is not the end of the story. You got to watch for the OSP, which is the official selling prices that Aramco will announce at the end of the week, probably Saturday or Sunday, because they might say we are going to increase production and then hike prices in a way where there will be no demand for it.
I see.
So in a sense, it will be win-win for both. Biden can claim they agree to increase production while the Saudis stick to their plan.
Gotcha.
The other point that they might announce a freeze on production, but increase in supplies, because supply is something else. And so they will come up with a scenario where they say, okay, the production is going to be fixed. No one is going to increase production. That will satisfy Putin and Russia. By the way, it will satisfy the Saudis and those who cannot increase production. But we are going to increase supply. How we are going to increase supply? Well, as you know, and you wrote about this before, their summer demand for cooling is so high, they need more electricity. That electricity comes from fuel oil, and they consume more oil in the summer. Now we are coming into the end of the summer, because the decision is for next month, not for now. By the end of the summer, they have enough oil to export, coming out of diverting oil from domestic consumption to export.
I see.
So they might say, we are going to fix production, but we are going to increase supplies. It's a win-win for both. Because
I see.
Biden can still claim the increased supplies.
And the supply increases because of lower demand for oil in power burn, which is so the connection between electricity and oil then becomes that much more obvious.
Absolutely.
Well, so just the last couple of questions, Anas, and it's great to reconnect and talk about these issues as always. So, what are you reading now? There's so much. I see you're in front of a big shelves full of books, and I know you're reading in Arabic, you're reading in English. What are the things that either books or other things that you're really captivated by now? What are you reading?
Well, because we have those spaces coming up on the SPR, so I have piles of papers just to remind me of the issues related to the SPR and all the new proposals for the SPR. So recently, I've been just reading about refreshing my memory on the SPR.
And as far as books go, are you reading books in Arabic? Do you have time to read books? I guess would be
and what I read in Arabic is nothing related to energy. They are mostly history books and literature, but not related to energy at all.
Well, I can't resist, and I haven't written it down, but broadly speaking, in the Middle East, do you think the trends there? You said MBS has changed, Saudi Arabia has changed. Are we seeing liberalization, more openness in the Arab-speaking world in the Middle East? Are those trends positive? How do you view kind of overall what's happening in that?
Well, it is hard to really. I mean, it's a short period, so it takes longer to assess the result of social change. But at least some of the issues that should have been resolved 30 years ago are resolved. There are issues where people confused tradition with Islam, and they thought this was Islam, etc. Now it's very clear it wasn't Islam, it wasn't religion, it was tradition. It was traditional issues. I think making that distinction clear was very important for people in the Arab world. And the other issue is even when he allowed women to drive, that has nothing to do with the religion. This was kind of a tribal tradition. And not even tribal tradition, because I worked in the desert when I was young, and women were driving all over the desert. And this was what, like 1979, 1980. Women were driving in the desert, but they are not on the roads. Right. So I think making this distinction is very important development. At the same time, the idea that there is always an enemy is disappearing. And this is very important from all sides, because historically, it was the feeling that you always have to have an enemy. And the idea now, no, we can deal with anyone, which is the true nature of the Islamic values anyway. So it wasn't about the terrorists who hijacked Islam, or ISIS who hijacked Islam, or Taliban who hijacked Islam. I think there is a positive contribution on that side.
That the relaxing of tensions, or this relaxing of the threat anyway, this idea that the constant threat has been reduced. That's
yeah, the idea that civilizations and religions fight and this stuff. I mean, it has no basis, but the fact is certain groups took it to that extreme. I think the Saudis succeeded on that front, and it is very clear from various things they've been doing in recent years.
Well, I wanted to talk about Iraq as well, and Iran, and of course Lebanon, but we can't fit everything into an hour. Last question then, Anas. What gives you hope?
Sorry, will you repeat the question again?
What gives you hope?
My children.
What makes you optimistic?
My children. We just went on a long trip all the way to the Canadian border in the north, and we came back. And
this is you and Gufran, and remind me of the boys' names.
Yes, Malik and Omar.
Malik and Omar, right?
Yes, and it just kind of, it was such a pleasure to see them growing up, and it just so they give me hope.
And you got to show them what America's really about, and the truck stops and the whole.
Well, it's funny because on the way, like when you see my 9-year-old talking about electric vehicles, and he's talking about the, I mean. He got his phone from his brother, and he was taking pictures of the coal barges in the river without me even knowing.
Huh. Because he'd never seen this, all new to him.
No, he took pictures because he thought he's doing something is going to please his dad, showing the coal being transported on a river. And he's only 9.
That's great. Well, Anas, it's great to reconnect. Thanks a million. We'll get this posted today. And, as always, there's tons going on in the energy business, and particularly in the oil markets. My guest has been Anas Alhajji. He is the editorial advisor at Attaqa, which is the only Arabic language media outlet focused on energy. You can find him at anasalhajji.com and on Twitter at Anas Alhajji. Anas, thanks again for being on the Power Hungry podcast.
Thank you. Have a good day.
And thanks to all of you for tuning into this episode. Tune in for another episode of the Power Hungry podcast. And until then, see ya.